Hello, I'm Olly and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today an update on my My Novel Life Challenge. All the books I've read from the 70s and all the books I'm going to read from the 80s. So I've been doing this really interesting reading challenge over the last few months. It was created by the author Mark Hodder on Instagram and it's called My Novel Life. And the idea is that you read a novel from every year that you've been alive, starting with the year of your birth and working through. So I was born in 1973. I started with 1973 and I've now finished the 70s. So I wanted to give an update today on how it's gone and also talk about the books I'm going to be reading for the 80s. And this wasn't deliberate, but when I look back at the books I chose for the 70s, I think they are kind of quite representative of the decades from a popular fiction perspective anyway. And looking forward to the 80s, I think I've got 10 fantastic popular fiction books that really kind of represent Western popular fiction and like English and American popular fiction in particular during the 80s. So the kind of things that were really successful then. There will be some rereads for me in the 80s, but also some books that I've been meaning to read for ages. So really looking forward to it. So let me start then by giving you my wrap up for the 1970s. So the first book I read was Black Girl Lost by Donald Goines. So Donald Goines was a black American writer of crime fiction. Really dark stuff. Very grim, very depressing, but very compelling. I've really liked all of the books I've read by him, and this one was no exception. So about a teenage girl who gets kind of caught up in drugs and prostitution. Very dark, but Goines' books always kind of have a hopeful edge to them as well. There's just something about his writing. It's quite rough around the edges, but it really works. So I very much enjoyed that one. After that then, a book I didn't enjoy so much from this side of the Atlantic, that was Jack Carter's Law by Ted Lewis. So this is the prequel to Lewis's famous book Jack's Return Home, which was filmed as Get Carter with Michael Caine. I really liked Jack's Return Home, but Jack Carter's Law I didn't like nearly as much. So this is basically a gangster novel set in 1970s London, and it uses all of those kind of London gangster cliches that you'll be used to from many movies like The Long Good Friday and things like that over the years. Now this may be one of the earlier examples of that style of kind of crime fiction, but I just didn't enjoy it. It's very tense at times, but overall it just didn't hang together as a book for me. From 1975 then, something very different and very huge, I read Shogun by James Clavell. So this is a book I've been trying to read for literally decades. So I had a copy of it in my early 20s, tried to read it then, didn't manage to. I think I tried in my 40s to listen to the audiobook and didn't manage to. I finally conquered it, and I did do a review video on this one. So a huge sprawling novel of Japan, about an English sailor who gets washed up in Japan and kind of becomes part of Japanese society and gets involved in a plot to kind of between warring factions to decide who's going to become the next shogun. So a very enjoyable, epic historical novel. I really enjoyed the kind of culture clash element of it. So the kind of comparisons between European culture and Japanese culture. Some of the political intrigue got a bit much for me, if I'm honest, and it certainly didn't need to be over 1,000 pages long, which is how long it is, but still a very good and interesting book, and really, a hugely successful book in the 1970s. Spawned a very successful TV show as well. So definitely felt like a good choice for a book from the 70s. After that then, something very different from a series I'm reading through and really enjoying. That's the Executioner series by Don Pendleton. So I read the book Colorado Kill Zone, which came out in 1976. So this series of books follows a kind of vigilante character going up against the mafia. The guy's name is Mac Bolan, but he's also known as the Executioner. In this book, he's in Colorado, in the mountains, at a ski resort. So it was kind of like Die Hard at a ski resort. It was really fun. Definitely one of the better books in the Executioner series. And I think that whole kind of vigilante and one-man army kind of thing is something that was quite common in 70s fiction. So Death Wish, the very popular novel by Brian Garfield, came out in the 70s, and people got really interested in the concept of vigilantes, I think. Mac Bolan is a classic vigilante character, so yeah, that was a fun one. After that then, another one I didn't enjoy quite as much, so this was The Thorn Birds by Colleen McCollough from 1977, but I think an interestingly representative book for the 70s. So the 70s, I think, was a time when America in particular kind of became aware of the rest of the English-speaking world. So, had certainly for a long time been aware of the UK, but became aware of countries like Australia, where the Thorn Birds is set, and interested and intrigued by, what those countries were like. So the Thorn Birds is a kind of family saga type book, centering around a family who are sheep farmers in Australia. There's loads of detail about Australian life and about farming, which are really, really interesting. The kind of family saga side of it, I didn't enjoy quite as much. There are some great set pieces, but the central story of this book is about a relationship between the daughter of the family and this guy who's a Catholic priest. And there are definitely uncomfortable parts to the description of that relationship. It's a book that was hugely successful in the 70s. My mum definitely read it when I was a kid. And it's one of those books, I think, that was, for some people, their first experience of reading saucy stuff in books. And there definitely is some saucy stuff in here, although not nearly as much as you might expect from a book that's over 700 pages long. From 1978 then, Eye of the Needle by Ken Follett, a thriller writer who more recently has become known for his historical fiction. This is a World War II thriller set in the UK about a group of people trying to track down a German spy who has got the secrets of D-Day and is trying to get those back to the German High Command. So a really tense and enjoyable thriller. Had a really interesting depiction of kind of life in Britain during the Second World War, so during the bombings and things like that. So that side of it I thought was really well done. And I think in the 70s, fiction about the Second World War was starting to be a bit more kind of introspective and starting to think a bit more about the lives of ordinary people and not just about kind of the heroism of the military. This is definitely a book that reflects that. And finally then, from 1979, The Totem by David Morrell, which was a really enjoyable and weird and tense horror novel about strange goings-on in a small town. It starts with the discovery of a body by the local sheriff, and things kind of get weirder and weirder from there. And this is a book that definitely taps into that kind of 70s sense of paranoia. You really get this concept that there is just, there is something strange going on in this town, and nobody, including the reader, really understands what it is. So another really enjoyable, tense read. So that brings us on to the 80s then. And as I said at the start, I think I've got an absolutely crackerjack set of 10 novels to read for the 80s. So very much looking forward to this. I think about half of these I've read before. Some of them are books I had back in the kind of 80s and 90s and never got around to reading for one reason or another. So definitely looking forward to those. So the first one is a book by an author I've come to really, really like over the last few years. So from 1980, my pick is Mockingbird by Walter Tevis. So Tevis's books, he wrote both science fiction, so he wrote the book of The Man Who Fell to Earth, and also kind of almost sports books. So he wrote The Hustler, which is about pool, and Queen's Gambit, which is about chess. So books about, people competing. I really love those books. I like those books, The Hustler and Queen's Gambit, more than The Man Who Fell to Earth. Mockingbird by him is another science fiction book. I don't know very much about this one. I do love his writing, so even though I'm more of a fan of his kind of contemporary fiction than his science fiction, really looking forward to this one. From 1981 then, one of the books that I definitely had a copy of at some point in my life but never got around to reading, that is Gorky Park by Martin Cruz Smith. So I talked in the section about the 70s about this concept of America becoming interested in the rest of the world, and Australia in the case of the Thorn Birds. I think America also became really fascinated by what was really going on in the Soviet Union in the 80s, and Gorky Park, an example of that. So a book set in Russia about a detective investigating a crime. So a very, very well-known book, was very successfully filmed as well, and is the first in a whole series of books about the same detective, Renko, by Martin Cruz Smith. So hopefully I'll enjoy this one now that I'm finally getting around to reading it, and I can read the rest of the series as well. After that then, a book by an author who's become hugely successful for his fantasy work, but started out writing horror. That is George R.R. Martin. So I had a copy of this book, Fever Dream, which is a vampire novel, I think set around the time of the American Civil War. I had a copy of it way back when and never got around to reading it for some reason. The only George R.R. Martin I read kind of back in the 80s and 90s was his kind of comic book inspired series Wildcards, where he got a group of different writers together to write this series of like interesting superhero stories. So I really enjoyed those back then and always meant to read Fever Dream but never got around to it. It's got a great reputation, so I'm really looking forward to trying this one. From 1983 then, you've got the first of the rereads. I had to have Stephen King in my novel life somewhere, and I've chosen to put him in 1983 with Pet Sematary. So I think I've only read Pet Sematary once. I remember it being, fantastic, but I read it before I was a parent, and I think it's a book that probably hits particularly hard with parents. So very much looking forward to that one. King, obviously, a massive writer in the 80s, as he has continued to be, but in particular in the 80s, he really came to dominate the horror genre. After that then, for 1984, another huge writer from the 80s, that is Tom Clancy, and I'm going to be rereading his first book, The Hunt for Red October. So I was a big fan of Clancy's stuff in kind of the 90s in particular. Read all of the earlier Jack Ryan books. I think I've read all of the Jack Ryan books that were actually written by Clancy. I remember this one being particularly good, so very interested to reread it. And it's an interesting book because it's one of those books that was kind of a breakout success. So it was actually originally published not by a traditional publisher, but by a naval publisher as an example of kind of tactics and things like that, which is something that Clancy is known for having been particularly knowledgeable about. So yeah, very much looking forward to rereading this, and I do like a good submarine story. From 1985 then, something very different, another book I've read before. I read this, I guess, in the late 80s or early 90s. This is Perfume by Patric Suskind, which is a weird, creepy horror novel about a guy who is obsessed with smells and with collecting the smells from people. So I remember it being absolutely excellent. A European novel that was translated into English and became very, very successful. So yeah, really looking forward to revisiting this one, and pleased to have a working translation on this list as well. From 1986 then, another horror novel, and one I have read before, but like ages and ages ago, Light at the End by John Skipp and Craig Spector. So one of the early splatterpunk novels, the kind of new wave of horror that started in the 80s. This is a vampire book, really looking forward to rereading it because I don't really remember anything about it at all. From 1987 then, another reread for me, a dark crime novel, The Black Dahlia by James Ellroy. So this is the first of Ellroy's famous LA quartet. I really want to read all four of them. This is the only book by James Ellroy I've read, so it maybe seems strange to be rereading it, but I remember it being fantastic. I haven't read it for a long time, and I do want to read that LA quartet, so I thought I would start right back at the beginning again with The Black Dahlia. So clearly about the famous Black Dahlia case, the murder of Elizabeth Short. So yeah, very much looking forward to rereading this one. From 1988 then, another dark crime novel, The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. So I have read this before, clearly, really looking forward to rereading it. I recently reread Red Dragon, the first of the Hannibal Lecter books, and thought that was absolutely fantastic. I remember liking Silence of the Lambs even more when I first read it. I think the Hannibal series kind of goes off the ball a bit after that, but the first two books are definitely excellent. And again, very representative of the 80s and the kind of obsession with serial killers that really started in the 80s. And then finally, from 1989, another science fiction novel. So I've got a science fiction novel at the start of the 80s and another one at the end. This one is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. So I'm a big fan of Simmons's horror fiction, and was back in the 80s as well. So I read things like Summer of Night and Carrying Comfort in the late 80s, early 90s. Hyperion is one of those books that people really rave about. So definitely looking forward to trying this one. I believe it's kind of a science fiction version of the Canterbury Tales, which sounds maybe a little bit pretentious, but apparently it's very readable. Anyway, that's my update on my Novel Life Challenge. Do let me know what you think of my pick of the books from the 80s. Do you agree that I've got a crackerjack series of 10 books representing kind of what popular fiction was like in the 80s. Let me know what you think in the comments. And also let me know if you're taking part in the My Novel Life Challenge yourself. Anyway, I will leave it there and say, as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.